You're listening to WPG 90.9 Gorham, Portland, Southern Maine Community Radio from USM. Live from the Orion Cygnus arm of the Milky Way galaxy, this is Scientifically Speaking, a weekly half-hour program devoted to elegant curiosities, and I am one of your hosts, Sarah Chang. Joining me, as always, is Bernie Rhyme, DJ Starwatcher. How are you, Bernie?
Yes, hi Sarah, very good, thank you.
Bernie's our professor of the astronomy lab at USM and our local protector of the night skies. Reach out to us at WMPG Scientifically Speaking at gmail.com or on Twitter at WMPG SciSpeak. And if you miss this show or any of your other favorite shows, you can go to WMPG.org to find the last 5 weeks of archives. Bernie, could you let our listeners know what is up in the night sky for this coming week?
Yes, good, thank you Sarah, I'll be glad to do that. All right, so today is Friday, April 2nd, right after April Fool's Day. So it's going to be a real story. It's going to be a waning gibbous moon, so it'll be just about last quarter. So basically that comes up about midnight. So unless you're up late, you won't see the moon, which is good. So basically then you have one planet in the evening sky, and that'll be Mars. It's heading right through Taurus right now, and it was passed by the Pleiades a little while ago, so it's still between a couple of star clusters in Taurus. So of course Mars is so interesting now with the Perseverance rover, all the neat new things. We're going to send a little the little drone Ingenuity is going to be sent out this month. Ingenious little drone. That'll be sent up this month, so something to look forward to. And then if you like getting up early, you can still see Jupiter and Saturn in the morning sky. And then Mercury will be fading out, and in another week or so, Venus will reappear in the evening sky. So we have a couple other things to look for there. So that's pretty much it for the beginning of April.
Exciting. Any meteor showers coming up?
Oh yeah, that's right. Good point. Yeah, because we have a long drought after January 3rd. There's nothing until April 22nd, and that's the Lyrids. So they'll be coming out of Lyra, which is part of the Summer Triangle, which if you stay up later, you can see it now. Otherwise, it's not coming up till next month. But they come out of the constellation of Lyra in the Summer Triangle, and they'll be on April 22nd. So a few more weeks for those. Yep.
Hooray. Awesome. Thanks, Bernie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And if you couldn't take notes fast enough, you can also check out the monthly What's Up column in the Portland Press Herald.
Okay, yes. So we have a very interesting guest named Gary Lawless. He's co-owner of a bookstore in Brunswick called Gulf of Maine Books. I've known Gary for probably over 10 years now. And I always used to stop in there at least once a week to visit with him and meet a lot of interesting people at his bookstore and so on. And he's also a poet, and he's done many other interesting things. So this will be a multi-pronged approach with seeing what all the things Gary has done. And he's worked with a lot of different type of people that we'll be talking about. And he's a musician and so on. So I'll let you take it from there, Gary, to see what you want to start with today.
Well, that kind of throws it in my lap. Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you, Sarah. Buckle in for the ride here. Well, I'll start by saying that I'm a native of Maine. I grew up in Belfast, then I went to Colby, got an East Asian Studies degree, and at the end of in 1973, at the end of my Colby education, I decided instead of going to graduate school, I was really interested in poetry and in especially things Japanese and Chinese. So my favorite poet at the time back then in 1973 was a poet named Gary Snyder, who had spent 10 years in Japan in and out of Zen Buddhist monasteries and was a poet of the mountains and the woods and the sea. So instead of going to graduate school, I wrote to him and said, can I come and live at your house as an apprentice? That's basically what you did in the Renaissance. If you wanted to learn a trade or a skill or an art, you went to the person who had the skills that you would like to have. So I ended up hitchhiking to California and changing my whole life completely, really, because I'd just been this dumb kid in Maine, and all of a sudden I was around all these really incredibly intelligent, interesting people. And to make my hook into Scientifically Speaking, when I got there, I thought, oh, I'm going to learn about poetry. This is great. But in 1973, sort of the topic of the time where I was how to think in terms of a watershed or a bioregion rather than a political region or something that was
Mm.
corralled by human borders. And so all the poets around there and the artists around there were trying to rethink the maps and try to figure out how to speak as one small entity that belonged to a much larger system.
Mm.
And with Bernie, the systems get really, really large. But it made me think about it's like I came back to Maine, and eventually my partner Beth and I opened a bookstore called the Gulf of Maine, and the basis was that because that was how we saw our bioregion, that we lived in a place where all the rivers drained into something that was called the Gulf of Maine, and it was bordered by Massachusetts, by Cape Cod, and by Cape Sable in Nova Scotia, and it was a definable piece of the landscape. And then and then the fun thing then is to wonder, you know uh, who's been here before, what was here before the glaciers were here, what was here right after the glaciers were here, what's been around. So you look at, I just took a senior college geology course a year ago because I wanted to learn more about what's just below the surface of the region where I live. And I love having conversations with Bernie because I'm learning what's above the region where I live. And which sounds funny, but a lot of people that's what you used for guidance. You didn't have GPS devices, you had stars.
Mhm.
And people a long time ago knew way more about the stars than most of us do now. I mean, navigation was primarily a star-based thing, and the Catholic Church would burn you if you said certain things about the stars.
Yeah.
But the poetry that I've been interested in since coming back has been a lot of poetry that connects with the natural world and tries not to romanticize it, but rather connect with it in a way that's actually scientifically true to form. And I've done some interesting arts residencies. I spent a month on Isle Royal in the middle of Lake Superior, and learned about when I was there that summer. It's a 48-mile long island, and there were 2,200 moose and 30 wolves and less than 100 people over the summer, or when I was there. So I was really hanging out in moose territory rather than human territory. But it was also on a really big bird migration route. So a lot of the birds that were passing through weren't birds I was familiar with here in Maine. And a lot of the plants were different, and I had to learn who they were. And of course, as a poet, I'm not necessarily, I don't think plants care about their Latin names. What do they call each other? What do butterflies call each other? They don't go by Latin names. So I was, that's kind of the poetic thing, is like, what's the interaction here between the mosses and this particular type of rock, and what's happening here? And, so my poetry became more interested in the natural world and less interested in learning to write a good villanelle or sonnet, although those are great skills too. I'm not saying that is bad. I'm just saying my particular way of perceiving the world and talking about how I perceive the world came through poetry. But then when I came back here to Maine, I also saw that there were all these groups of people who weren't being represented in the conversation of the community. And I thought maybe poetry is a way of getting people to tell their own stories. So I started working first with adults with disabilities at an arts center called Spinderworks. And then for 2 years, I was at Preble Street working with homeless and low income folks. And I've worked with combat veterans. I've worked with refugee populations. I've worked in jails.
Oh.
I think that everybody has a story, and everybody's story is important. And that one way we learn to get along with each other is to listen to each other's hearts, and I don't think we do that enough. But it's one way of encouraging voices into the community, which I find really interesting. So, my poetry is not necessarily this kind of academic, and I'm not using that as a pejorative. I'm just saying there are different styles of poetry and different interests in poetry, and mine is more dates back to the oral traditions of the Neolithic, basically, rather than classical English poetry or something. Does that make sense? Am I making sense here? Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's very
So in
interesting. I
terms
didn't. Yeah.
So I really love people like Bernie who have specific knowledges of things that I know so little about, but would like to know about. It's like when you have a bookstore, people come in and you find out what they're interested in because you see what books they're asking for. And then if you're like me, you can mine them for information. You can say, "Oh, you're interested in the Big Bang. Well, tell me what happened in the first 2 millionth of a second in the Big Bang." That which is what a book I'm reading now is explaining what happened in the first few millionths of a second in the Big Bang, which I can't, as a poet, I can't even. My head doesn't work that way. I can't imagine it. And it was dark, right? There was no light.
Yeah,
There weren't
the
stars
universe
yet.
didn't even become transparent till 380,000 years after the Big Bang.
Hear that? See, but that's a poem right there.
Well,
That's a
yeah, it
poem
would
right
be, of
there.
course. I should write that.
Uh, you know, and imagine, and that poem would be different from probably from a language culture based on the continent of Africa, or from a language culture based on the Asian continent. I mean, and it's really interesting to me that all the different ways people have expressed their connections to the natural world through poetry. You read Chinese mountain poets, and they're so gorgeously written, and their connection to the natural world is so wonderful. And they're not necessarily romanticizing it; they're experiencing it. They're out in it, rather than sitting in a room writing about it. And so I want my poetry to seem like it actually comes from out there in the world, rather than sitting in a room thinking about the world. And in order to do that, you have to go out in the world. You have to really. So there's a long, and so for the last 42 years, my wife and I have owned a bookstore in Brunswick, which is kind of an independent alternative bookstore, which basically means we don't carry stuff we don't like.
That's good.
And basically, people tell us that our bookstore is curated. And I think that's pretty true. We select things that we're interested in, or we know that the people who use our bookstore would be interested in, but they might not know about them yet. So it's fun to surprise, say, "Oh, look at this." Like Bernie was there the other day, and there was a woman who's very interested in volcanoes and has worked as a volunteer at Mount St. Helens for several summers. And there was a new book about a woman who was a volcano addict, basically, and was following lava around the world. And I knew that my friend Priscilla would want to read this book.
Okay, there's so much in that little short 5 minutes that you just gave. I want to break down some of that actually.
Good luck.
Because no, okay. So one of the first things that you had mentioned when you said you went to do your apprenticeship in California, you had mentioned that the way that they, like this group of poets, I guess, saw the world was not with borders, but rather like the watersheds, I guess.
Yeah.
And I don't think I had a question so much as more of a comment, where, that's, I think like the idea of borders is so like ingrained in our heads right now because that's kind of what we learn, in terms of like that is what geography is, and like when you learn about like world geography or even any kind of geography, that's you learn about the borders. And I think America is really interesting because the way that the borders of the states are made up, if you see like kind of the 13 colonies, like the eastern side versus kind of the western side, it starts moving into kind of these geometric shapes, very defined shapes, that are no longer based on natural formations. I'm not sure if all of the ones here are, but for example, like part of Ohio, it follows the Ohio River, and that's the border between Ohio and Kentucky. But then as you get out, then you have Colorado, that's just a rectangle, and it doesn't follow any of that.
It does have a pretty heavy western wall, actually.
Yes.
There's these things called the Rocky Mountains.
No, that's true. That's true. But it's not like it follows the shape of them.
No.
It just cuts. It's just a straight line.
Yeah.
On the map, anyways.
And then when you think about how states are created, well, I don't want to get too much into that, but Maine was created so that Missouri could become a slave state. I mean, that's the Missouri Compromise, Maine became a state so that there could be another slave state. So, gee, we should be proud of that.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't even know.
Yeah.
Read about the Missouri Compromise. There couldn't be another slave state unless there was another non-slave state. Maine becomes a non-slave state. Missouri becomes a slave state. Thanks a lot, Maine.
Yeah.
But yeah, those borders are. Well, look at gerrymandering. Look at voting
Oh,
borders.
yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, these are. But if you're a migratory species, what are the borders?
Yeah.
And migratory species, there are migratory species in Maine that just go up and down. There are turtles, there are frogs, there are things that just go up and down, just migrate up and down. Other things, there are all these critters that come through. But I think of well, I carry it to an extreme. I think granite's a migratory species as well, but if you think in terms of plate tectonics and continental drift, granite's a migratory species. It's moving around. Everything's moving. Water is a migratory. It's And if you talk about, if you're learning geography, what maps are you using? Because the maps change all the time. Look at a map from 10 years ago. Look at Africa, for example, from 10 years ago. Look at the names of the countries. Look at a map of like when you're talking about the United States, look at the names of, look at a map of Maine with the original Native American names for rivers and places rather than the imposed English names or Scottish names or Irish names, and a lot of those names are very watershed conscious. A lot of the Native American names tell you what's happening at that place on the river or what's happening at that place on the edge of the shore. Here's where the shad are. Here's where the rapids are. Here, I mean, they're like having your own Delorme Atlas in your head. Once you learn the place names, you can come down the river and you'll know what's next. Next there's a waterfall, next there's a portage, next there's a good place for drying fish. And that our minds used to be informed in that way. Now we're building walls along the southern border, to keep people out who are escaping from some situations that we help create in Guatemala and El Salvador and places like that. And yet we deny them access to a free life. And that's not just the U.S. I mean, look at what's happening between Africa and the southern European countries. People who are trying to escape and will do anything to be able to have their children survive. It's just so. And it was a really interesting way to look at the map. And I really hadn't thought of that much. But there was a few years ago, there was a great bioregional event when a sewage treatment plant in Berlin, New Hampshire was taken out by floodwaters, and all, like, what was it, 2 million gallons of raw sewage started coming down the river from Berlin, headed for Casco Bay.
Uh-oh.
and the weather report, every few hours they would tell you where it was now. It's on its way, here it comes. And people kind of learned about their watershed, who's upriver and who's downstream from us. And you can think of air in that, the smokestacks in Westbrook, who's downstream from that, or dioxin in the river in the Penobscot area. There are all these, like, with Native people in Maine still trying to get, they can live in the river, but they can't control what's put into the river.
Right.
So can they eat the fish from the river? So those concerns supersede sort of nationalistic ideas, but in order to be a real citizen of your watershed, you really have to spend the rest of your life learning how to live there, learning what the natural systems are and how to be less damaging to the systems that are in place where you are. What birds stop over there in the spring to eat before they go on, or things like that. What do the butterflies need in order to be able to live where you are and then migrate? There are so many things that and a lot of people are relearning that. A lot of people are relearning about native plants, for example, and what plants the bees need and the butterflies need, and that's science, but you can write poems about it. You can. I think sometimes of poetry as a way to get people interested in scientific processes in a different way. It's like, like Mary Oliver poems or something. You speak about a natural process in a poem, which is different from a text, but maybe it speaks to someone's heart and they get interested and they want to learn more. And then who do they go to? They go to the folks like you guys who know stuff and can tell them stuff. I mean, my geology teacher was so exciting. It was really, and I'm almost 70 years old and I'm still getting excited about this stuff, and Bernie tells me great stuff, but it boggles my mind. But so does the geology teacher. And I was in the bottom of the Grand Canyon once and saw the Vishnu schist. And I mean, how many million years old is that rock? And just thinking that way, you have to be kind of poetic or you just get overwhelmed. But you can't romanticize. I mean, if you romanticize it, that's a different thing. And I think that's falsely leading people, was that a way long answer to it?
No, I wanted you to keep going. Because I was going to ask you too, another thing that you mentioned in your very brief introduction was that you had talked about, well, you highlighted that your poetry wasn't really, it's not a sonnet, it doesn't fit like a specific structure or anything.
It could. If I feel like it does, then it does. I mean, I have to, my original teachers told me you have to learn how to use all of the tools, but you don't use them all at once. When you're building a house, you need to know how to use all the tools, but you don't always use an adze, or you don't always use a plane. You use different tools when they're called for. So you might feel like all of a sudden, wow, this would make a great sonnet, then you do it. Or you start writing it, all of a sudden it has 14 lines and you're like, oh, that was, I mean, it's not that I disparage the tools.
No, I think that's a really great point, because there are a lot of tools out there in all sorts of different fields, but you don't necessarily need them to make progress or to learn something, but they can be helpful if you know how to use them. And I think that's the hard part, is knowing and discerning when to apply them and when not to.
Yeah, that's, when I go to do poetry workshops, the first thing is, does it have to rhyme? Or does it have to sound like the now infamous Dr. Seuss?
Oh yeah, right. They canceled him.
But those are good things. Dr. Seuss is iambic pentameter. You need to know what an iamb is, and he provides an access. If you want to know what an iamb is, a 2-beat da da. So if you listen to "I do not like that Sam I am," I am is an I am.
No.
I do not like that Sam I am. That's all iambic. So there and it's not censored yet. But although the Republicans are trying to tell people that Dr. Seuss has been censored by the libtards on the left. But if you want to have some books sell that haven't been selling well for a while, announce that you're going to take them out of print and make it sound like they're being censored. If you look at the New York Times bestseller list this week, Dr. Seuss is all over it, man.
Oh yeah,
it's a great,
a lot of free press.
It's a great idea.
And then you also mentioned that it's really dangerous to romanticize the natural world. Why is that? What do you think?
Well, I think if you romanticize the natural world, you're taking part in its destruction. If you romanticize it and everything is fine and beautiful, it's not. Species are going extinct every minute. I mean, so if you allow yourself to just romanticize, you're sort of objectifying the natural world, and if you romanticize it, it's going to disappear. You're not taking part in kind of protecting it, and you're not taking part in living with it. You're kind of seeing it from a distance. And I don't mean to say it. That's not a. I think that romanticizing it is useful in some ways, but in the long run, it's really not. That you really have to engage and be truthful about it. That the idea of loving something to death from afar. Like I really want grizzly bears to exist, but I may never see one again. Doesn't mean I don't want them to exist, but I also want people to know what they need and what their lives are like, and how we impinge upon other places, other species, other people. You know, I mean, it's we romanticize. Well, we romanticize some of the immigrants that come here too. I mean, we romanticize lives and don't really know about what they're actually like.
Mhm.
You know, I don't know. So and that's, you know, it's the romantic poets I really like Keats and Shelley and people like that. I'm just not. That's not what I want to do. I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's bad. It's just not what I want to do. I would rather be part of trying to keep what we have left of the natural world, keep it around, and maybe make it a little better rather than a little worse. But that's, you know, that's just, I think as a citizen of a watershed, you have to behave like a citizen of the whole watershed and not just a human citizen. There's so much going on, and that's why education is really important, because we don't understand a lot of what's going on. You know, explain the lichens to me. You know,
Oh yeah, lichens are
not
amazing.
even. There's another symmetry, Bernie. The
Yep.
lichens. They're two
Yes.
things. It's
Well,
not
not
one
just
thing.
two. Now they're finding 3 to 5 cooperating things in lichen. Not just two like we used to think.
Yeah.
Not just algae and fungi. It's way more interesting.
There's
than
all
that.
sorts of stuff going on.
Yeah, yeah. But you had
I
a really
just,
good point with rights when you were talking about rights of plants or animals or trees and even river. There is something that will really start making legal sense when we give these nature-based things like actually rights. It's called a rights-based ordinance versus
Yeah.
a regulatory ordinance. And I was part of that in Newfield. We did some of that work right here in Newfield, Maine. And it's really interesting because then they're going to have like a legal representation. And then all these things you're talking about now, because you were talking about having to participate and engage in this, then this will really come to pass. And then the courts will see nature as having a right just as much as
right.
human, or
Yeah.
even.
There was a good book about 25 years ago called Should Trees Have Standing?
Hmm.
And it argued about legal standing for other species.
Hmm.
And now there are places in Europe where rivers have standing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, should natural systems have standing? I mean, who speaks for the protection of a whole natural system?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, of course they should. I mean, the whole point.
It's going to
Yeah.
fall apart if you
Yeah.
if you take out pieces of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's going to be a
Poetry.
huge jump.
Are we talking about poetry?
So who
Yeah.
does speak for those rivers in Europe?
Oh, there's some wonderful people. There are wonderful organizations. There are wonderful people. You know, there's this is cool. There's an Italian bioregionalist movement, and back in the mid 1990s, they started publishing an Italian bioregionalist magazine, and they put some of my poems in the magazine, and then they did a little book of my poems, and then they thought maybe they should ask me.
Mhm.
So they asked me, and they had translated them into Italian. So, and so I ended up going there a bunch of times and doing readings and hanging out. And they've published 5 collections of my poems in Italy because they think they help introduce ideas of watershed and bioregionalism to people who might not get it if you just hit them over the head with a scientific text. But you know, they've had 2,000 years longer than we have to screw up their landforms, you know. So, but like our friend Giuseppe, who we go and stay with in the Po River Valley, has just published a piece that wolves are returning to the Po River Valley in the center of Italy. And at first they were worried about acknowledging that because the hunters would come and kill them, you know, but now they're I guess safe enough that there are bears coming back into the mountains. Some of them came over when the hostilities were happening in Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia. Some of the bears and wolves moved west to get out of the well, it's assumed, who knows, but they came west and down into Italy. So these bears started showing up, and now there are wolves, and there are a lot of younger folks who are going back to organic farming and gardening, and you know, there's a whole but all across Europe, but it's not just Europe. I think everywhere there are people who are seeing that the Western technological model doesn't really work for the natural world, and that maybe we do want to share the planet with some other species other than ourselves, because it's going to be pretty lonely.
Yeah.
No, with everybody else gone. the only other creatures alive will be all the microbes inside us who are still very excited. Maybe we could get a new virus in here.
Right.
But that's a whole other, I mean, where's your watershed? I mean, I'm a watershed for all these microbes. There are all these critters that are living inside me that can't live outside of my skin. That's the wall. If they came outside into the air, that'd be kind of the end of that.
Yeah. All right. Check out part 2 next week. You've been listening to Scientifically Speaking here on WMPG with myself, Bernie, and Gary Lawless. Stay tuned for Sports Jam with Colin and Connor. And from your favorite nerds, mask up, and we wish you healthy bodies and clean air.